Hey guys, Scott here. I spent like the first hour of my stream today just bouncing ideas off of my chat back and forth, and we were trying to figure out how we could fix the Skull Merchant before she comes out in such a way that it is very simple. Mostly they're just sort of number changes or very simple things to implement. A lot of people had some crazy suggestions like the drones move by themselves and stuff. Like they're not going to code a whole new like AI system for the drones in a couple of weeks. I wanted to make these changes as simple as possible, but they would also make the killer an actual threat while also maintaining her identity and not really emphasizing the unfun parts about her power. Now, a lot of these ideas are not bulletproof, they're not perfect, and a lot of them I would prefer to be way more fleshed out. But like I said, I want these changes to be something that are actually feasible to be done in a very short amount of time. And so that's what these kind of things boil down to. So I wanted to go over what her basic gameplay style is. She's a tracker and she has some semblance of stealth. And I think we should buff up the stealth aspects of her kit way more because we don't want to buff the anti-loop power that she has, which is drop a drone and force you to leave the loop because it's just terrible design. It's really boring. It's not fun for anybody. And then once the survivor's injured, they can't leave the loop anymore. And now she just doesn't even have a power to begin with because making someone exposed while they're injured doesn't really do anything. So I wanted to buff up the stealth aspect of her kit. So one of the first things that I think we should do is make it so if you're inside an active drone, it applies oblivious to all the survivors inside instead of applying undetectable to the killer. Now, the reason that's a lot better is because when the killer is approaching the area of the drone, you can tell she's coming. You hear the terror radius getting louder and louder and louder, and then it just drops off. And you're like, okay, well, obviously she's about to come hit me now because you can hear the buildup and then the drop off when she enters the range. So she can't really sneak up on people or anything like that if they're paying attention. Now, if you apply oblivious to every survivor inside an active radius, well, now that's a different story because now she can really approach from anywhere and you can't hear her terror radius at all. As soon as you leave, then you'll be able to see it. Another big thing is I want it so you can't see the drone's giant red circle AoE until you're already inside of it. Once you're inside of it, then you can see exactly where it is, and that's fine. But I don't like that people can see across the map which areas they should avoid and they can plan their routes accordingly. Her whole thing is she's supposed to make these unsafe areas where she has surveillance and she gets buffed up by it. But if the survivors can see exactly where those areas are, it doesn't really accomplish anything. I think it would also be more thematic for her too as well, for the survivors to not realize they're being tracked until it's too late and they're, obviously in the middle of the thing that's tracking them. So those two things alone would increase her stealth potential a lot. And I think we should focus on giving her a much easier first hit as her chase power. For example, Wraith doesn't really have that much of a chase power, but his chase power is that he gets a very quick first hit, and that's usually enough to have the duration of a normal chase. Her second hit's probably going to have to be a normal down, just like Legion gets a very quick first hit, but then can, just try to get a normal down after that. And I think that's sort of what we should incentivize because it moves away from the whole 3-gen thing. It moves away from the whole drop the power at the loop and get exposed thing. And it makes her stronger by removing half of a chase, potentially, if survivors are paying attention. But say survivors want to break the drone. Right now, you get the claw trap on you if you break the drone for I think 30 seconds, but it doesn't really do much of anything. If you can see where the survivor is, that's cool and all, but it doesn't really do much. Good survivors don't care if you know where they are, and typically if you have a good game sense, you're going to kind of know where people are anyway. Plus, there's a whole plethora of perks that can give you the information too. And I just feel like the claw trap being on you is not nearly enough. So I want to introduce this sort of interesting dynamic where survivors get to choose the handicap that they have. So say there's a drone at the generator or something like that. Now you can have a survivor break that, or they can stay in it and risk the expose and the oblivious. And those are their two options. They can risk the undetectable nature of the killer so she can get a jump on them, or they can destroy the actual drone. And if they do that, now they get a claw trap on them, and the claw trap will do something different. Now, there's a lot of possible solutions with this. People said that you can make it oblivious as well. So if you have the claw trap on you, then you're oblivious and you can't track the killer. But I thought it'd be more creative to have the survivor choose between oblivious and the killer can see you through walls, basically. So the survivor is going to either choose a weaker chase or a chase that starts when they're not ready for it. So I think giving the option to the survivor introduces some type of agency that survivors will enjoy, but it'll also make it so the killer is still in a winning situation every time. And so the survivor breaks the drone. They get the claw trap on them. And while that claw trap's active, now the killer can see where they are. And when the killer is actually right nearby and within 8 meters, they can just see their aura through walls if they have an active claw trap on them. So the risk now becomes if you destroy that and the killer comes and chases you, you cannot mind game the killer whatsoever, and the killer can mind game you pretty much with ease. They can see when you leave the loop. They can pretty much destroy you at TO walls, things like that. It gives them a lot stronger of a chase while not making it so there's absolutely nothing you can do to begin with. And I think that would be the most interesting way of doing it. There's a lot of other good suggestions, but basically we need to incentivize the choice between staying in an active zone or destroying it and getting the claw trap. And they both need to be somewhat equal in terms of detriment. So if somebody takes one for the team and destroys the actual drone for the rest of them on the gen or something like that, then that person is going to suffer. And I think that's how it should be. So those are like main suggestions. And then there's a lot of other just like quality of life stuff. Like, for example, removing the cooldown on placing drones. I don't know why there's a cooldown. It makes no sense. It's not like it's OP to drop 2 drones like right next to each other. You can't even do that. So it doesn't matter. I think activating drones should have a bit of a cooldown, and that cooldown can stay. But just simply sending out your drones, it doesn't need to have a cooldown. There's no reason for it. Additionally, we need to make it so you're not slowed down when you're looking at your radar. There's no reason for this. Clown can move with his bottles out, and it's way more potent. Why can't she move at full movement speed while holding her radar out? Makes no sense. Just make it so she's not slowed down looking at the radar. And you might argue, well, then she could always be looking at her radar, and that's, who cares? The chances of a survivor being in your limited amount of drone areas is pretty low. Give her some value out of it, for God's sake. It's not that big of a deal. Additionally, I want the red AoE to be less blinding for the killer because it is incredibly blinding. Once survivors cross that threshold, I actually sometimes have problems tracking where they even go. So that blinding red AoE, I think, needs to be addressed and removed or made a lot more dim. I also think there's not enough drones. Because there's like only 3 or 4 drones that you get, it sort of pushes you towards, hey, 3 gens, 3, 4 gens, 3, 4 drones. Let's just use it at this. Instead of what I think would be cooler to make sections of the map dangerous and surveilled, the limited number kind of pigeonholes you into wanting to do a 3-gen build. Now, I understand people will still do that, but there's no getting around it. You can't prevent that. It's impossible. The most we can do is incentivize other playstyles, but you can't fix that. It's just, that's a core problem with the game itself, not the killer. So I think just having an additional drone would be better. I also think the drones need a slightly bigger AoE. If the drones have a bigger AoE, it doesn't change the 3-gen thing at all because they're still going to plop it at the generator. It doesn't matter if it's 4 to 8 meters bigger. But if it's a bit bigger, it might incentivize people to leave drones in other areas to make, like if you're at Fractured Cowshed, the barn itself might be, the entire thing is dangerous now or something like that. And there are a couple of niche scenarios like on The Game, for example, where you'd be able to cover a large portion of the map. But again, I don't think we should let certain bad maps dictate the entire game. The game is just a bad map. We should be complaining about the game, not what is possible on the game. You can get a nurse burning a game offering and make you have a miserable time. You can have a doctor doing the same thing. Like, that's the map that's the problem, not what you could do with this killer on that map. So I think it's important to keep something like that in mind as well. Also, I think there needs to be a bit less strict of a placement of drones. I do think you should not be able to place them on hooks and things like that, and that's totally fine. But you should be able to place them a bit closer together so you could have a web of obliviousness, and I think that would be pretty neat to incentivize the stealth play style as well. You can have an entire section of the map where it's very spotty and touch and go with Oblivious. And yes, this would also affect 3 gens and stuff like that too, but with these changes, I mean, it's already going to be strong. There's no way getting around that. Like I said, that's more of a game problem. And the more we incentivize other playstyles, although we will see the 3-gen thing, we'll see less of it because other things are more viable and people will have less problems when they're doing those playstyles as well. Another controversial one, but I think this is important, is that the exposed progress from staying in a surveillanced area and active surveil, it should never decrease. That timer should never go down, much like a Ghostface stock. That meter will never actually go away. However, it takes longer to build up. So what we're going to have is a dynamic where maybe it takes 20 seconds to build up instead of like the 10 seconds it currently does. So it takes a lot longer. But it does ensure that you're probably going to get an expose on someone at some point. However, the counterplay from the survivor is once they're very close to getting exposed because they can see their meter, they can go willingly search out a drone and sit there and get exposed when the killer is preoccupied with someone else and reset it themselves. So it actually gives survivors an interesting secondary objective, or they can choose to play riskier and just repair the gen and risk the expose. And I think that would be something to give survivors something else to do, while also introducing more game delay to a killer naturally by incentivizing people to go do something else, much like Wesker has the potential to one-shot if people ignore it, but people can ignore it and do gens, but they risk the one-shot. So I think things like that are better for the game. Additionally, if we make the expose not decay, but it also lasts longer, and the duration that, there's no like decay of it anymore. If we do that, then it also de-incentivizes the whole boring playstyle of just dropping it at a loop and waiting for the guy to get exposed, or they leave the loop, and that's pretty much it. So it's less incentive for that as well, which would be really good. I think also a couple of little quality of life things. Drones, active drones, can show like boon totems in the area. They can show items on the ground, just like little icons of a little toolbox, or like icons of like a boon or something like that. Just little cool things that are not game changing, probably won't even do that much, but that would just be neat. It would be very fitting as well, and it could be a slight benefit. Additionally, I think active drones should highlight windows and pallets in their AoE. This is great for newer players. It doesn't really do anything for better players, so it doesn't make her oppressively strong or anything like that. Basically, just gives you Zancian tactics in an active area for the drone. It would show up just like as, like a red glow through walls. I think something simple like that, very thematic as well, but it could help in certain scenarios, especially if anyone's like picked a pallet back up, if you don't remember if you broke that pallet or not, just things like that. It could be very useful. And that's mostly, I think, how we do it. I think it's very important we introduce that dynamic of the survivor choosing to forego the obliviousness at a risk of them being much easier to chase. I think that gameplay dynamic and that choice would be far more interesting than what we currently have. And a lot of these changes, in fact, almost all of these changes, to have very, very little like mechanical things to do. It wouldn't take very long to do any of these. You could easily do this in the 3 weeks before the killer comes out. I specifically picked things that would not take a very long time, not entirely new mechanics, things like that. Mostly these are just number changes or slight tweaks to already existing mechanics. The aura reading would probably be the only actual straight up new mechanic that they would have to like tag onto it, but they have aura reading on 500 things. I'm sure it's pretty easy to just throw that on there. I'm not saying it's going to take a day or two, but I'm saying within, almost a month before it comes out, I think these would be pretty viable. So going on the whole killer's philosophy, I think we should incentivize the stealth playstyle way more. That will naturally increase her chase power because she might have to chase half the amount of time. If people choose to risk staying in the area to work on gens and they don't want to risk the increased power of her chasing, then they can just sit in the actual gen when it gets activated. Eventually that's going to build up, but they also have a secondary objective now of going to do something else and activating the expose themselves when they're in a safe area, but they might not know because now they're oblivious and the killer. So it just introduces a lot more interesting things rather than I do 3 gen or I drop drone at pallet and that's it. So I think these changes would be really nice. It would make me way more excited to play her as sort of like an assassin type killer instead with like cool tracking. Basically, she would be a less lethal Wraith with more tracking than Wraith. And I think that would be a specific niche that no one really has. And I think that would be very interesting to see. So curious to hear you guys' thoughts on it. We bounced this back and forth in my chat for a while, but my chat is hardly the entire population. There's very obviously stuff that we could have missed. So if you find any glaring flaws with any of these suggestions, I'd love to see it. But that's all I got. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.